So in class we talked about some of these starting projects, some of the Z-sphere models, some of the mannequins, the jewelry, and some of the stuff for 3D printing. There's a lot of stuff to start with in ZBrush, but usually I will go about it the way I showed you in the other videos, where I create a sphere, add it to the document, and sculpt on it from there. But if you want to quickly do that without having to do all of the steps, there are a few options right here for opening up projects that are already ready to go. So if I just double click on this one right here, and it'll bring up a sphere and it's ready to be sculpted on. So no need to convert it to polymesh or even add it to the document. I also talked about my brushes that I usually use. I'd say generally any of the brushes that look sort of like a sphere or that they were created from a sphere are going to be sculpting brushes. Brushes like this one that have curve in the name, or IMM brushes that are for inserting meshes, lasso brushes, selection brushes, and some of these other ones here at the bottom. They're not necessarily used for the sculpting process. They do have functions, but for the most part, you're probably going to stick to probably these 6 brushes. Clay buildup is probably one of my favorites, followed by the Dam standard, which is short for Damien standard. The move brush I like, but I actually use the move topological brush, and I'll talk about why I like that one a little better, or why I use it more in just a minute. But I want to talk about Dynamesh, and Dynamesh is going to be over here in the tool menu under the Dynamesh section. During class, I added it to my UI. If you want to add your Dynamesh button to your UI, you can. It's one that I use a lot, so I like to see that it's active without having to go into the menus. If you go into Enable Customize, hold down Control Alt, click and drag, and drop that into your UI wherever you want to put it. Now, I've only used the resolution slider and the group button. There are some other options here, but I tend to really only use these 3, and I really don't use the group one too often, so it's mainly the Dynamesh button and the resolution. I'm going to turn on the polyframe, and that's Shift F on your keyboard, or you can press the button. I'm going to show you what Dynamesh does. I'm going to go in with the clay buildup brush. I'm going to start sculpting. And you'll notice that some of these polys are getting really stretched out, and they're doing something I call faceting. When you turn off that polyframe, you can see it's really not good. And if you smooth it, it really tries to take a lot of the sculpting out of what you did, and it tries to get those polygons back to where they were, but they're still showing their edges, and you don't really want that. So what I'll do when I'm working with Dynamesh is I'll start sculpting something, and then when I'm ready, I'll use Dynamesh, and what it does is it looks at the topology, or excuse me, it looks at the model, and it analyzes the surface, and it creates a more even topology for the model. So I'll do this a lot. I'll start sculpting and I'll make a lot of large chunks, and you see this kind of gets a little crazy out here. And I'm just going to re-Dynamesh it. And the hotkey to do Dynamesh, if you don't want to go back to the button, turn it off and turn it back on, is hold down Control on your keyboard, click and drag, and then release. And it's going to be the same as the mask, but when Dynamesh is active, the mask hotkey has a double function. If you have a mask on your model and you have Dynamesh turned on, when you go to run Dynamesh with the hotkey, the first thing it'll do is clear that mask. And then the second thing it'll do is do another Dynamesh on the model. Now, it may not show up. You may see that nothing happens. But all you have to do is make a small adjustment to your model and then re-Dynamesh. And it should create some new topology there for you. Sometimes it takes 1 or 2 times. So the next thing with Dynamesh is the resolution. Now, right when you look at your model, it doesn't seem necessarily too low poly or too dense. It's kind of sort of in a good place for the initial sculpting. But if you want to change the amount of polys, maybe you need some more, maybe you need a few less, you can use the resolution slider here. So if I up this to, let's just do 200. Hold down Control, click and drag. Okay, so it really went in and added a lot more. And you can see whenever you smooth it out, you know, there's actually some resolution there that's allowing you to have some nice soft geometry. If you want to take the model back down a little bit, this is too dense, let's go to 32. Control, click and drag outside of the model, and it brings it back down to something a little more normal. The less that you have to work with, the better in the beginning. If you're trying to sculpt a lot of polys, it's just going to be difficult. So if you want to take it down even further, let's go to 16. Make sure you make a small adjustment to your model. Sometimes I'll just smooth it, and then you can click and drag outside of it and it will re-Dynamesh it. Having too many polys can really add details to your model that you don't necessarily want. It's hard to get a really nice smooth model whenever you have a lot of geometry there. So I'm going to back up just a bit. I'm going to go back to the very first undo. Don't forget your undo history is up here, and if you want to take any step back, you can. Looks like I might need to undo just one more time. There we go. One thing I didn't mention when I opened up this project is that there's a grid on the bottom of the model now. Now this grid, it's not like it is in Maya. It's going to be exactly at the bottom of any model you make in ZBrush. So if you have a model and you lower the bottom point, you notice that it'll actually snap down to it. So while this is helpful in ZBrush, it's not going to translate into other software. You may actually have a model that's sort of sitting in the middle of the grid in Maya if you bring it in from ZBrush. But that's this button right here. It's called the floor or the floor grid. You can turn it off or on. And you can also add a second plane. So I just turned on the X. You can also turn on the Z. So you've got all 3 directions there. And these buttons are really tiny, but just to activate them, you just click them. I'm going to leave it on X. Excuse me, I'm going to leave it on Y. And then I'm going to go back to sculpting. I'm going to turn Enable Customize off. I meant to turn that off earlier, but I forgot. Okay, so whenever I'm sculpting, I usually start with a face. And I'll use the clay buildup brush. I'm also using the bracket keys on my keyboard to resize the brush, but you have the ability to resize it through this menu here. If you right click on top of the model, you have the ability to change your draw size there as well. Your focal shift is going to have an effect on the fall off of the brush. So the harder or the lower the number, the harder the brush. And again, for the most part, we've been sculpting additively. If you want to subtract, just hold down Alt and sculpt on your model. And there's a ugly phase that your model is going to go through. It's not going to look good when you first start out, so just keep working on it. It'll get better, I promise. One other thing we talked about in class was this perspective distortion. This is basically swapping your model from a perspective camera to an orthographic camera. So this is the true side view of your model, but this is the view with the perspective turned on. I'm noticing that I actually have my model backwards. So I'm going to turn it around, and that's going to be a good introduction to the Move, Scale, and Rotate tool. This thing is actually, it's improved quite a bit over the years. Now, we didn't talk about this in class, but it's very important to learn because you'll use it a lot. So this is very similar to how it is in Maya, but you want to maybe hold down Snap, or excuse me, you want to hold down Shift to snap. Now we've actually got my model rotated correctly. So the Move, Scale, or Rotate tool, it doesn't matter which one you choose. They're all a combined tool. They used to be different, so I think they just still have the buttons around. But just like in Maya, the circles around the model are there for rotating them. The squares are there for scaling, and the little cones are there for moving in certain directions. But what the one in Maya doesn't have is this outside control. So whatever direction your camera is facing is going to be what this sphere and these little triangular icons are going to be based off of. So if I were to rotate to the side and rotate the model, you'll see that it's been rotated based off the camera. If I turn my camera and then move it, it's going to also be based off of the camera. So if you're trying to be very precise in working with your model, you may want to snap to the side before you do any sort of rotating or moving, or you can use the designated controls to do that. This one will just move in the Y direction. It's not based off of the camera. Same thing with the scales. They'll scale in a direction rather than not based off of the camera. Now, these little icons up here are also pretty helpful. You'll notice that you have the ability to lock and unlock this. And this is going to give you the ability to move the pivot point. In Maya, the pivot point of the model, it's absolute. It's what it is. It may be in the center, it may be on the bottom of the model, but until you change it, it is where it is. In ZBrush, there really aren't any pivots in the model. These are just based off of the tools that you're using. So you can move the pivot in ZBrush, but it won't affect the pivot in Maya. And I'm doing this from the side view so that I don't actually accidentally move the gizmo off into space. But I'm also holding down Alt to unlock it while I do this. And that'll allow me to move the pivot rather than move the model. If you don't want to hold down Alt, just click that open and click it close when you're done. If you click that one, it'll reset its position. And this one will go to the center of the mesh. And this one will put it on the axis. And again, that one will reset its orientation. If you go into this one right here, you get a few deformers, but we can save those for another day. I just wanted to quickly rotate my model. I got a little far outside of the Dynamesh demo, but this is helpful. I'm going to go back into draw mode. And now I'm going to talk about Sculptris or Sculptris Pro. That is going to be in your stroke menu. You might have it in your UI, but if you go into the stroke menu and you go into Sculptris Pro, it's this little button right here. And I'm probably going to put that in my UI if I don't already have it. The options I don't usually change, so I don't have any need to put these buttons in my UI. But it looks like it's actually already here. I'm just going to move it. So enable customize, Control Alt, click and drag, put it right over here above the render button. Enable customize and store config. Now Sculptris is pretty fun, but to see what it's going to do, I'm going to turn on the polyframe, and I'm going to turn my X symmetry back on, and that's X on your keyboard. So when you're using Sculptris, you'll notice that your cursor turns to a purple color, and when you hold down Shift, it turns orange. That is just kind of indicating that, hey, you're in Sculptris. And you'll notice that if you sculpt on your model, it will actively tessellate it. So it's basically adding geometry whenever you need more. So the bigger your brush is, the more it's going to reduce the amount of polys there. The smaller your brush is, the more it's going to add. So my process for modeling is to get the base shape built out with Dynamesh, and then I'll start in with some of the details with Sculptris, but I won't add all of the details until I've completely rebuilt the model and projected the details back onto it. We'll get around to that later though. Okay, so this is the very, very early stages of a model. I'm sculpting and removing and sculpting and removing a lot of the stuff that I've added. At this point in the process, you don't want to get too tied to what you've made already, because this is it's probably one of the most important parts of the model. You're spending a lot of time trying to get it proportionally correct, and that's not going to happen immediately. So don't spend too much time trying to add any details to a model that's still has its silhouette being worked on. And don't be afraid to remove stuff. But sometimes you can't create the shapes that you're wanting to create. And I'm gonna go ahead and talk about masking and groups. Now I'm gonna turn Sculptris off for this, and I'm gonna go back into the regular standard brush. So whenever you're holding down Control and you're using Dynamesh and you do the whole click and drag and it, redoes the topology, I'm going to undo that and I'm going to turn off Dynamesh. So the other function of this hotkey is to clear a mask off of your model. Now if you have somehow added some what looks to be like a darker color to your model, this is called a mask. And whenever you're working with a mask, you can sculpt the parts that are unmasked, but anything you have masked is not gonna change. So I'm gonna clear that. I'm gonna undo it. By default, the mask pen is selected. You do have other options here. There's a lasso, a curve, a circle, and you can mask with a circle or a rectangle or a square. For the most part, I just do a rectangle for this sort of masking, or I'll use the mask pen to mask. And you'll notice that the mask, depending on the geometry, may be more precise versus kind of pixelated, and that's because the mask is held within the point there. So we're basically masking points, and if there's more resolution or more points in an area, the softer your mask is going to look. Now if you switch your mask to the mask lasso, this works kind of similarly to the way it does in Photoshop, but not exactly. You start out and you've got a point that it ends right there, but you can continue to add more to the mask and just sort of finish it off like that. Again, if you want to clear the mask, hold down Control, click and drag outside of your model, and then let go. I'm going to switch mine back to the mask pen. Going to mask some of the eye area. Now if you want to invert your mask, hold down Control, click outside of the model, and it'll invert the mask. It'll do it again if you tap it again. Now to actually erase the mask, it's going to be Control, Alt, and then Paint. And then it'll clear the mask that you've made. So if you paint a little too much, you can always reduce it a little bit. Now if you want to soften your mask a little bit, you can hold down Control and tap on the model a few times, and that'll soften out the edge. Be sure you don't accidentally do what I did and add another mask up here. And that way, whenever you're sculpting, it's got a bit of a softer fall off, but it looks like it's creating these little bumps here, so I'm just going to undo that. So if you want to use masking a little further, you can go here into the masking menu. Any of those hotkeys we just went over are here, so inverse, blur mask, grow mask, sharpen mask. And you can also mask by certain features. A lot of different options here in the masking section, but for the most part, I'm just usually doing a regular mask pen or a mask rectangle, sometimes mask lasso. There are certain instances where you will use a lot of these, but probably not on a face right now. Okay, so I've masked the eyes here, and I'm actually gonna mask inside of the eye because I want to get the eye socket as well. Because what I'd like to do next is talk about groups. So you may have noticed earlier when I turned on my polyframe, my model was red. Yours might be green or purple or yellow or some other color, but the color is just indicating that this is a group. This is one group altogether, and there are no other groups with it. If I want to add a group, usually what you can do is mask an area that you want to have grouped, and you can go into polygroups. Now the hotkey to group something that's masked is Control W. Now mine didn't make a huge color change, it's just a lighter red or a more pink red. I can see it, but just for the purposes of being able to show you a little better, I'm going to undo that and I'm going to do Control W again. And now we actually have a better contrasting color here, and you can see a lot easier what's a different group. So if you do Control W with nothing masked, it will mask everything in that subtool. If you have an area masked off and you hit Control W, it'll mask that. So it's sort of another double function hotkey, but it's related this time. So what I'll do sometimes, especially for characters, is I'll go through and I'll group certain areas. And the great part about groups is once something is grouped, you can hide it. So hold down Control and Shift and click on the group. And if you click on it one more time, it'll invert that view and it'll be hidden. It's still there, it's just hidden. So it's going to make it a little easier to come in here and make another mask. Control W, Control Shift click. And I'll make another mask around the nose. Okay, so I'll do this for some of my models, and it's a good way to redirect the topology whenever we use something called ZBrush, but we're not going to use that just yet. I just wanted to show you some masking stuff. And you may want to be careful of things like this. I left some geometry out of my mask and it did not group it correctly. So let me undo that a little bit. Make sure I don't get the part back there, and then I'll try that one more time, and it got it that time. That's great. Same thing here. I may need to back up a little bit to get them all masked, but that should do it for now. And the benefit of this when you're sculpting is you can do something like this. So I'm just going to mask out the mouth, or at least the upper lip, or the beginning of the upper lip. Control W. So let's hold down Control and Alt and get rid of a little bit of that. There we go. It's a little skinnier this time. And you know what? I'll just actually add this to it. And I'm just backing up, masking, and then undoing so that I get a better mask. Okay, so I'm going to hide that. Control Shift click on it, and Control Shift click on it one more time. And then for the bottom lip, now you don't have to do this when you're sculpting. This is just one of the little techniques that I like to use when trying to isolate certain parts of the body that are hard to sculpt on. Control W to mask it, and we can bring that back. So now whenever you're sculpting on your model and you don't want to affect the bottom lip, I'm going to turn off this polyfill so we can see the mesh. I'm going to hold down Control and Shift, click on that bottom lip. I'm going to actually use the mask rectangle. I'm going to mask that whole bottom lip there. And now you can see I can come in here and sculpt on the lip, bring it down, and it doesn't actually intersect the bottom lip. Makes it a lot easier when you're working on close-up areas. So I'm just going to invert that mask really quickly. I'm going to hold down Control and click outside of the model, and then I can actually work on just the bottom lip without affecting any of the geometry around it. And you may want to add to that mask. It doesn't have to be masked by the group. Let me just remove some of that mask there. The group is just a quick way to be able to isolate it. Okay. I'll clear that mask, Control click and drag outside of it. And it's not amazing, but it's on its way. Okay, so you can kind of see how using Dynamesh to create the overall basic shape of it is important, and then incorporating Sculptris later on to get a little more of the detail into it. There's another process that we'll cover later where we talk about subdivision levels and dividing your model, but we're going to save that until next time.